Great, and we're recording. Welcome back, guys. My name is Ben Fellows. Thank you again for visiting. Today, I am joined by Joel Varty. Joel is the CTO of Agility CMS. He's been in a variety of other engineering leadership positions in his career. I'm really excited to get his perspective on things. Joel, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ben. It's great to be here.
So, Joel, we were just talking a little bit right before we hit record. Walk me through your experience overall in your career with QA, how QA has evolved from your perspective, both as an industry, but also maybe what you've learned along the way and how that perspective has changed kind of your approach to it. I know you've actually had a variety of experiences, large and small. Just maybe set the stage for us about kind of where QA fits in your world right now.
Sure. Right now we're at the situation where I'm working. Agility is a SaaS company, so it's a platform, it's a product, and it doesn't sort of change that much cycle to cycle. As we go through, we have 2-week sprints. It's kind of, we try to keep most of our work items types things are small, and so there's a pretty good rhythm in terms of hey, this thing can be handed off from, an engineer can hand this off, someone can test it, or what are the automated tests that can be run and who's managing those? How does it fit in with the integrations? Because it's iterative, it's really easy to get that process set up and kind of moving. And so the idea of something being done is a really well-known fact. And I think that's when I've seen conflict in the past. It's when we worked for agencies and other things like that, where you have these projects and every client is different. And then it's really hard to establish what are the QA processes for a certain piece of functionality or maybe an entire system. Because first of all, you're trying to do it under budget, so you don't have enough time. You never have enough money to really do it. And so, and you're mentioning this earlier, QA just kind of gets tacked on, and you throw everything over the wall and say, hey, go test it. And by the way, don't find any problems because we're done and we're out of budget, right? So
or if you miss the problems, then it's also your fault. Go ahead.
That's right, for sure. And so no one ever feels good about that. And you can only screw up worse. Whereas I think if you can set up a culture, and in the organizations I've been with, this tends to be a thing that's like initiated from top down, but it tends to bubble up. If you can keep a good culture of, we want to find problems early, and you want to be the person that found this. And it's kind of delightful to say, hey, check out this cool thing I found. I can break this system. And it's awesome. I broke it because now, we don't get embarrassed later. We don't have to go fix this thing and roll it out, on a Sunday night when, we don't want to be working. So if you can have a culture of let's find these things early, then more people want to be involved with it. And what we've found is that it's not the dedicated QA that tends to find things. It's developers. The developers and engineers will find things both in their own code and for each other. And that's just great teamwork if you can kind of establish that.
So you've mentioned what is done a couple of times to me, and it's interesting listening and thinking to that, because what I'm curious to know is where along your processes do you establish what done means? Is it the acceptance criteria going to the developer? Is it reviewing the test plans? Is it just collectively? Like, if you're a QA person in an organization and you're listening to this, what does done mean to them?
It's probably one of the hardest concepts to get clarity on, and it's something that we revisit constantly. In fact, one of our main rocks for this quarter as an organization at Agility is establishing a better feedback loop, because done, especially when something comes in from like if a potential customer asks for something, or if an existing customer asks for something, or if someone finds something broken, then what done means for them is you rolled it all the way out and they're able to like, oh yeah, I tried it again, now it works. And that can sometimes take a long time and things can drop off. But along the way to getting that rolled out, maybe it's a fix, maybe it's a new feature for everyone in that process. So maybe I'm an engineer and I'm actually writing the code that's going to, fix that thing. For me, done tends to feel like I clicked, I checked it in and I created my PR. And, it's in Git and hey, my hands are off it. I'm not going to write any more code on this. I'm done. We're trying to foster more of a holistic, like full circle attitude with these things where it's like, I'm part of this process. Now I'm invested in it. And now I have a level of accountability, but I'm not necessarily responsible for the next portion. So yes, I clicked create, on my pull request, or I actually got it checked into a UAT environment, something like that, where now someone else can sort of verify things for me, and it's not necessarily my responsibility. But I think we want to allow, we call it like responsibility versus accountability. So everyone kind of becomes accountable for helping this thing along and kind of maintaining advocacy for something and understanding how important it is to get that through to the customer, because until that customer sees it, then what's the point? You just did all this work and really kind of for nothing. You might as well just flush it down the toilet, right? So if you can understand where you're involved in that process, and then everyone gets to then celebrate when, hey, the customer, we Slack the customer or email them and they come back with, hey, it looks awesome, you solved the problem, whatever. Now we can all celebrate because we're all part of it. So getting a collaborative approach in there, I think, is really important.
So that's really interesting, and listening to that, right? Because so much of that also speaks to a statement that we had talked a little bit about pre-recording, which is, can change come from the top down for the bottom up? And thinking about so much of the audience of this, hopefully being QA people looking for leadership and looking for advice. Is this something that has to come top down, or can you help put some of that in place from the bottom up? Or like, how do you make the change in that organization? If you were looking at it from the outside, if somebody's listening to this and saying, is there a place to start along that way? Like, where would you start?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, if the organization that you're currently part of doesn't listen, if you don't feel that you're kind of heard as a QA person, that's a red flag for me. And there's a couple ways to kind of address that. I wouldn't say it's a red flag saying, go quit your job. It's a red flag as in, maybe you haven't established your voice as being important, and the voice of QA is important. And in the organizations I've been in, it typically has been a top-down thing to make sure that everybody knows, hey, by the way, QA is just as important as every other part of the process. In fact, it's more important because it can save us more money than literally anybody else. Because if you wait too long and you ship this thing, you may not find it for years. All these bad things that can happen. So in my experience, it tends to have to be top down. If you work for an organization who hasn't established that, that's going to be difficult, because now you have to kind of like bubble up that mentality. But that can work too, especially if you can say, hey, look at these other organizations that are doing this process. We should be doing it like them. Here's this organization X, organization Y. Maybe, I spend a lot of time on tech Twitter, and I follow a lot of different people from different organizations. And a lot of them are pretty public on there, especially folks in the developer advocacy roles. They can give you really good insight as to the engineer managers that they've worked with and how they've been able to have conversations with those managers to invoke change and to like get process to improve. I mean, this is how the DevOps sort of big change kind of happened. I think probably around 5 or 6 years ago, where the idea of, hey, it takes me 2 or 3 days to build to do a build of the product. Well, that's horrendous, right? We want to be able to do builds multiple times per day if we need to. That takes a complete cultural shift. And a lot of that stuff did come from like a bubble up from the engineers or from the QA folks or from folks in DevOps roles. So you do have a voice, but you kind of need to enhance your voice a little bit with like, hey, these are other folks that are doing this, or, we collectively as a team, we have a way that we can save everybody money. This is what it costs us to do a cycle. Every time we roll out something, it tends to cost us this much time in terms of hours and resources and whatever, compute, things like that. So if you can show ROI too, that is even better.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because the way that you're phrasing this, I wrote down this and I appreciate it so much, which is like, save us more money than anything else. You're looking at QA as a value add, where I think a lot of other organizations are looking at QA as a cost in some capacity, or a necessary evil, even as sort of sort of in the most dramatic way. Where and how along the process do you see that shift? Is there different stages in an organization where your relationship with QA comes in, or is it like you have to always have that mindset? And I'm not sure I'm doing the best job of eloquently. I'm just trying to understand, are those completely mutual exclusive, or is there a world in which like one kind of is justified by the other, or is it really like, look, this is a value add, you have to view it as a value add? Because I guess I'm conditioned oftentimes why people to view what like you're stopping the release, you're causing the customer to be upset, right? How do you change that in an organization?
That's the golden egg right there. I think that if you can develop an engineering organization where every single person understands that a problem, if you put a problem or if you put a bug into the system, you've costed everybody money. And sometimes we're okay with that. We ship things and I know it breaks in these set of circumstances, but we're going to ship it anyway. And I totally appreciate that. Lots of startups go through that all the time where, hey, we need to get this done. The plane needs to take off right now and we got to bolt the wings on before we take off kind of thing. But we know that we can't land yet. So we're going to have to build, that's a good mentality to understand. So there's the known issues and then the unknown issues. If everyone in the organization understands that it's their job to find unknown issues where we're all part of QA, then first of all, if you have specific QA engineers, well, all of a sudden they are able to be enabled and they'll be way more heard because now you're the experts that everyone wants to know your stuff, right? Hey, what are the tricks that you're doing to find bugs? I wish I could find that quicker, right? That sort of thing. So that is a cultural thing. It's kind of a top down, kind of a bubbling up. It's just one of those things that if it works with an organization, then you know you're in the right place. And if it's not working, if everyone doesn't kind of have that attitude, if it's an us and them throwing it over the wall, that to me is an issue.
Yeah. No, and that makes total sense. And so let's go back to the world that you've created, right? And a more positive approach to QA. Can you talk to me a little bit about the structure specifically in an ideal way? Because I know you mentioned a couple of things. Developers are catching more of the bugs, right? Is there a manual? Is there automation? Walk me through kind of your ideal QA structure now that we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges of QA. Yeah.
I mean, in an ideal world, think about it. Imagine if you have a backend API that is, you've created, a pretty good architecture for your system and you have some front end stuff, some back end stuff. They need to talk to each other. Part of that is a backend API. Well, you need to have as much automated testing as you possibly can. So we talk about code coverage for things like use cases. That's really, really important, not just to get the code coverage, but to get the case coverage. Did you actually write unit tests that handle real world cases? And if you can't answer that question, then we can't really move on to step 2 because we don't know how that API is going to be used, right? And so you can keep you can kind of break it down until you have these really small problems that you need to test. But do you have real world cases to test those with, as opposed to, hey, we're just going to test all the cases? Which is it that if you say, well, have you tested every single case? That makes a job really hard for someone who's engineering those tests. Whereas hey, I know some of the outlier cases, but I know most of the time it's going to be used this way. And that way we can have a better case coverage with our tests. Those are really great. And then now if we have, sometimes you might have multiple APIs that need to work together. You need to have some kind of integration testing. That's also a really good thing to do. And here's a good case. So, maybe you have one API for pulling data and another API for pushing data in. And there's a CDN somewhere involved. So a great test would be, hey, we're going to have something, a test that changes something. It's another test that clears that cache on the CDN, and something that tests that it pulls it in. Well, there's that's to me one holistic test that requires a bunch of different stuff to happen. But if you have an engineer who's savvy enough to kind of put that together and spread that kind of integration test around all of the functionality that you have, you just made everybody's life so much easier because you just run that every time you ship anything now. And you can run it when you ship it to a certain environment. So if you build it into that automated DevOps, and all of a sudden it's iterative approach. So the work that you're doing isn't something we're going to throw away. It's not tested it and we'll never run that again. The automated tests that can run over and over again are an incremental add. And the good thing is you don't have to get to 100% to continue to ship things. If you're already shipping software and your process works and you don't have any automated tests, it's not the end of the world. Maybe you're working really hard, but it's okay. You can keep shipping, but you can start chipping away at these automated tests that can make your life easier. And over years and years, if you're in a good, or maybe months and months or whatever it is, you'll all of a sudden have this suite of tests that basically gives you something that you know about your environment when you ship code. Knowing more and having fewer I think it works. Yeah, I think we tested. Did we test that? I think so. You need to know, yeah, it worked. And look, here's the results of that test. So I know that this worked. So we know that wasn't the problem if something's broken, that kind of idea. So,
well, it's interesting and listening to, go ahead. Sorry, Joel, my fault entirely.
Sorry, Ben. Yeah, I kind of gave you a gap there. But what also happens is that more people want to be involved in that, as opposed to it's like, oh, QA, that's boring. That's where skills go to die or things like that. Whereas like, no, this is where we can provide value ongoing that's gonna stick around forever.
So what's interesting listening to sort of the emphasis on automation, and I agree with it a lot. And what I want to ask specifically about in your career is have you seen automation? And you talked a little bit about this with the incremental additions, but like if a QA person's listening to this and they're, let's say working with a mature product and it's been around for a couple of years and they're thinking, okay, I'll start automation. That's a fairly intimidating project. I think most people underestimate the amount of time, size, and effort that's going to go into an automation project. But from your experience, how do you try to get that value from like day one, and how do you build on that? Because my concern is people try to do it. There's this changing environment. It falls apart. They don't really get the value from it. It's kind of the story that you hear. And I think that they say was, well, we didn't have automation from the beginnings. We can't have automation. So like, for somebody who's in a project already, where should they start? How should they approach it?
Yeah, a great question. I was in this situation. I've been in this situation, and the question normally comes back, well, what's the thing that will cost us the most if it breaks? Just pick a thing. Okay. And usually and we used to call that critical path testing. So every time we roll something out, we find we're doing the same manual tests, right? Yeah. And so it's like, well, let's just automate at least that. So what's the critical path? It's like these three pieces of functionality. Let's just create those tests, because we don't have to create 200 tests. Let's create 3 tests that now we don't have to do that critical path testing anymore, and we can slowly expand on that. So what is the one thing in your system that you are most afraid of breaking? Okay. Right? The thing that people use the most, and then maybe there's 2 things, maybe 3 things. And now you've got, a few Scrum or sprints later, you've got 10 things, and now that it just adds on. But if it's the most important thing, all of a sudden it's easier to find budget. It's easier to find resources, because it's like, no, this is going to make it sure that this critical piece of business functionality never goes down. Yeah. Or if it does, we know why.
So veering into the technical space a little bit, and this is something that I'm interested in your perspective on. QA and DevOps more and more seem to have more overlap than ever before, because QA is obviously part of a release pipeline. You have stuff like ephemeral environments. You have stuff like reseeding databases and thinking about the infrastructure and the environment. Do you see that those 2 things are starting to become more and more blended, and that the skill sets of managing that CI/CD kind of flow, whether it's in AWS or wherever you're deploying it, to me, from my perspective, not in the sort of CTO world, it feels like I need to know how ephemeral environments are running. I need to know how to reseed a database. Is that something that a QA person should be able to know in today's world, in your opinion?
Yeah, in a perfect world, you don't reserve, QA positions for junior people. That typically is in a lot of engineering environments. You'll start off as a junior developer and you get stuck with doing all the QA because you don't know how to do anything yet. So we'll make you do QA, which isn't a bad way to learn a system. It's not a terrible way to learn a system. Is test it, right? But those junior developers typically don't have as much experience with things like, spinning up a whole new environment, Terraform, or these kind of things like that that you need to be able to understand, if not create, so that you can solve more problems. And that tends to be a more of a senior individual. And so that really shows you if an organization is dedicated to QA for real, because are you paying someone to do DevOps full time? Are they doing QA as well? Or do you have multiple people in those roles that are expert level? They're senior level people that know how to do these things and to make sure that these tests are automated, that they're part of the DevOps pipeline in multiple environments, not just production. So that we can, make better use of all of this logic that we've created in terms of these automated tests, or making sure at the very least, like even DevOps with manual approval is better than not having that. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. And the engineering, the QA engineering part of the organization should be an active part of at least participating in that DevOps pipeline, but they should be involved in creating it and evolving it as well. So hopefully there is some crossover with knowledge. It hurts if you hire only junior people as QA, though. That will hurt you.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a really interesting insight, because I think that these sort of stereotype QA is oftentimes like the former customer service person who knows the app really well, so go in and test it, right? And once again, no shots at those people. I think that they're oftentimes evolve and they're really, really great QA, but it feels like in the industry there's this ever widening gap between that version of QA and the really senior technical minded QA, and there's not really the education resources to bridge that gap. And so what I'm interested in is, how do you go from that sort of like, hey, accidentally ended up in a QA role and I'm doing kind of manual testing, to the senior? Do you jump in and do dev work? Do you just go to a different organization and learn under somebody for a while? I mean, because to me, what I'm watching is a gap that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I don't see how it closes. It's a little esoteric question, so apologies.
Yeah, no, and honestly, so having hired people in the past couple of years, very difficult to hire and retain technical staff at any level. So the way we got around that was we ask our developers to do more QA, because it's like, hey, it's really hard to hire, or takes a long time to hire into these roles, as you have greater churn. I don't know any organization that didn't have higher churn over the last 3 years. If you're an organization that didn't, hey, kudos to you. We did. So that's a reality we dealt with by essentially doing the hard thing and asking our developers. It's like, you need to be more active as part of the QA process. Hey, great news. You have the skills that are needed there. You just need to adopt the mindset. So we just made that a thing. I'm pretty sure Shopify does the same kind of idea, where it's like, you're responsible for your thing. You need to advocate for your work item as a developer all the way through the chain, and you may not get any assistance from QA. So it just happens to be that's a mindset. Like, imagine you didn't have anyone testing your stuff. Now what, right?
Yeah.
Do you get a buddy to do that, whatever? Because that didn't really answer the question, because all I did is acknowledge it's like, yeah, there's a huge gap, and it's not just a growth gap. It's a hiring gap, because those senior QA engineers are gold. They are pure gold, because especially if they know DevOps. It's a question I ask every technical person that I hire. It's like, hey, do you know DevOps? Usually it's like, well, I know of it. I know that it runs, and I see the things spinning when I'm waiting for things to finish. But is that what you mean? Or they may be like, yeah, YAML is like, second nature to me. I love that stuff. Tweaking the environments through automation is what I do. And I'm like, okay, well, we're doing your next interview right now, and I'm going to bring in another engineering team, and we're not, just stay on the line kind of thing, because that person is like pure gold.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And Joel, I could keep talking to you and keep asking you questions now for minutes, but I promised myself I was going to keep these conversations at 20 minutes. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for your insights. I really enjoyed it. I think other people are going to enjoy it. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks, Ben. It's been great chatting.
All right. We'll talk soon, everybody.